I want to begin once again by expressing solidarity with the Ukrainian people and take the opportunity to issue a warm welcome to the many thousands of Ukrainians that have fled seeking protection here to Ireland. I also want to give recognition to the warmth and generosity of spirit and the community involvement exhibited right across the island of Ireland towards those Ukrainian citizens, primarily women and children, who have sought refuge here in Ireland. And it has to be said, the response by the Irish people has to be commended, including the efforts of such people as Colette Talbot and Nicole Brown and David White from my own county of Wicklow, who have just returned after delivering badly needed humanitarian supplies to the Ukrainian border, and people like Neil Traynor and Willie Coster and many others who are still there helping with the refugee crisis. The scale of the humanitarian crisis, the sheer human cost of this war means that the numbers of war refugees that we anticipate will reach Ireland over the next number of weeks and months could well run into a figure of more than 200,000. And the EU needs to adopt an approach to dealing with the humanitarian fallout from the war in Ukraine, similar to that developed to assist Europe in the recovery from COVID. To maximise the effectiveness of our response here in Ireland, we require a cross-party approach, and the government now faces the responsibility of putting in place the necessary systems to deal with the demands that have arisen from the unprecedented situation. And I believe the fluidity of the situation places a responsibility on the government to ensure that the opposition is kept fully informed and briefed on what is happening on a continual basis. And I also believe that there is a need to put in place a single point of government of contact within government for members of the Oireachtas that would be able to provide information across the broad sway of public services that TDs will and are being called upon to source for refugees within our constituencies. Taoiseach, next week I will take part in a delegation from the EU Affairs Committee that will visit Eastern Europe, where we will examine how countries like Moldova and Romania are attempting to deal with the refugee crisis. While we will be holding high-level meetings with our European counterparts, we will also be visiting border crossings to witness first-hand the scale of the exodus from Ukraine. We will also be attempting to identify the needs of the refugees and what efforts that Ireland can take at source to alleviate some of the suffering. The ferocity, the inhumanity and the deliberate strategy of targeting civilian targets that are apparent in the Russian strategy means that those that have fled the war are seriously traumatised by what they are having to endure and what they have witnessed. The majority of the refugees are also women and children. Large numbers of children are crossing the Ukrainian border unaccompanied, and numbers of those have arrived in Ireland also, arriving traumatised and vulnerable. There are also reports that vulnerable refugees are facing further threats from human traffickers who are targeting women and children at border crossings. And we need to develop a presence on the ground to work with local authorities to help guarantee the safety of vulnerable refugees. The ambassadors from Poland, Moldova and Romania appeared before a Dáil committee recently, and where the Ukrainian ambassador appealed to the government to charter aircraft to bring refugees directly from the refugee centres at the Ukrainian borders, where there is an increase in congestion and overcrowding, and where overpricing is preventing refugees who have lost everything from securing flights without assistance. And there is a real need to alleviate the pressure here before it participates in a further humanitarian crisis in the refugee centres. I also want to welcome the decision by Minister Eamon Ryan to investigate allegations of price gouging by Ryanair, and those allegations were made by the Ukrainian ambassador. And I think it is important that the message goes out that Ireland will not tolerate any war profiteering, and I look forward to hearing the outcome of the Minister's investigation. And today we have also heard reports that people are now starving to death in Mariupol, and Russia needs to facilitate humanitarian corridors to allow life-preserving supplies into besieged civilians. It is also important to note that Russia is also blockading Ukrainian ports, preventing badly needed food supplies, particularly grain, from leaving for poorer countries who are highly dependent on Ukraine for a source of grain. And Ireland has a responsibility to use its role in the UN Security Council and at the EU to ensure that international focus is maintained on the food crisis in other sites of humanitarian crisis. Gurmil Mogat.